at GWIX, focusing on discussing current Korea-related policy issues in the domestic, regional, and global context. And today's forum is co-sponsored by the East Asia National Resource Center. And for your information, we will send out a separate email to the attendees with a survey on today's webinar. So please fill it out and send back to us. It'll be greatly appreciated. I think the general elections in Korea last week stand out in a couple of ways. It was the first national level general elections that was done in the world since the global coronavirus outbreak. And even so, the turnout rate was the highest in 28 years, above 60% when you look at the general elections only. And the ruling Democratic Party won a landslide victory when Korea's general elections in the middle of the president's term often turned out very unfavorable to the ruling party in the past. So I think we have very interesting issues to discuss with the experts from Washington and also Seoul today. Let me briefly introduce our speakers one by one. So our first speaker is Stephen Costello, a non-resident scholar at GWIX. He's the director of the policy NGO, AsiaEast.org, and columnist with the Korea Times in Seoul. He was formerly director of the Korea program at the Atlantic Council of the U.S. and director of the Kim Dae-jung Peace Foundation, USA. And our next speaker is Celeste Arrington, Korea Foundation Assistant Professor of Political Science and International Affairs at GW. She specializes in comparative politics with a regional focus on the Koreas and Japan. And she's the author of Accidental Activists, Victims and Government Accountability in South Korea and Japan. And last but not the least, Dr. Heung-Kyu Kim, who is joining from Seoul. Thank you for staying up late at night for us. Dr. Kim is the director of China Policy Institute and professor in the Department of Political Science at Aju University. He is a policy advisory board member for the Ministry of National Defense and the ROK Army, and a member of the Foreign Ministry's Reform Commission. And he also served as director of Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on the Presidential Commission on Policy Planning. And here is how the speakers will discuss the election outcome and its implications today. So Steve and Celeste will discuss the election results from the ruling and the main opposition party's point of view, respectively, and follow up by Heung-Kyu's analysis on the potential impact of the election outcome on the U.S. ROK relations and Seoul's North Korea policy. So we'll also be taking questions from the attendees. So please identify yourselves when you type in your questions in the Q&A box on the right panel. So with that, let me turn it over to Steve. Steve?
Can you hear me now? Okay, good. Thank you for having me join. I began my association with South Korea 30 years ago, working in Seoul with the Democratic Party. We were part of a small group of consultants helping them to modernize the party with things like message management, policy, policy sophistication, and particularly with opinion polling. So I've been sort of up to my ears in two of the South Korean presidential contests, the one in 1992 and the one in 1997. Soon after that, I became an analyst and writer and an NGO director. But for now, I'm going to take a look at this from the Democratic point of view, looking back. The government and progressive parties won decisive victories in the assembly elections. The result is going to have implications for lawmaking and policy in the next 2 years. It'll have implications for the plans of potential presidential candidates for the May 2022 presidential election coming up in 2 years, and it will have implications for the battle over policy between the two main groups within the Democratic Party, the establishment moderates and the modern progressives. This was a pivotal election in several respects. Voting behavior may indicate that South Korea's democracy is maturing and that mainstream is a much more accurate description of the broad collection of Democrats, small d Democrats in South Korea. Slide 2, please. Keep in mind the context for the vote. Yesterday was the 60th anniversary of the April 19 demonstrations in 1960, when corrupt authoritarian President Seungmin Rhee was pushed from office by mass protests. 1 week ago was the 101st anniversary of the Korean Provisional Government, which kept democratic hopes for Korea alive during the 1910 to 1945 Japanese colonial rule. This record of popular organizing for democracy has a long and hallowed history for many Koreans. Korea only became a modern democracy in 1998, which is when the Democrats first controlled the policy from the Blue House. At 22 years old, this democracy is very young. At the same time, the central role of the legislature in political life has been key to the country's relatively peaceful transformation from dictatorship to authoritarianism to democracy. Authoritarians and dictators relied heavily on the legislature to provide a veneer of legitimacy, and Democrats relied on it to pressure the government, limit its excesses, and keep the door open for eventual democratic change. The most relevant, instructive, and useful models for South Korean social economic development are in Northern Europe. The discussion of these models was lively in the mid-1990s, particularly after the Democrats won the presidency for the first time in 1997. Today, these models and national dynamics that are similar to European countries are newly relevant in light of the assembly election. Slide 4, please. Yeah, back one. This is an important photo because it demonstrates a legislative respect from the Korean system that is absent in many other democracies. Can you imagine the U.S. government having a dinner for 3 hours with the collective party heads, Schumer, Pelosi, and everybody else, Mitch McConnell, sitting around a table, having heated arguments, apologizing, and basically going through with it in a civilized manner? This is remarkable, and it's just one more point about where South Korea's democracy stands today. Next slide, please. You others will get into the election statistics a bit more. I think perhaps the only point here is on the left, where you can see that voters in their 50s, by 49 to 41, are clearly leaning toward the Democrats across the board. And as these bars move down and people get older, it is very likely that the Democratic group, in the broad Democratic group across voters, is going to grow. Next slide, please. The point of this is just that even in the east side of the country, which has traditionally voted for conservatives, although the Democrats lost some seats, they gained in votes. That doesn't matter right now very much, but it will matter in the presidential election when each vote counts for one. So in both cases, it just seems to solidify the now control of the Democrats. This was the first election in Korea and across the globe during the deadly coronavirus pandemic, demonstrating that elections can be successfully conducted with the right mix of government and public safeguards. Voter turnout, as Yanaho pointed out, was the highest in 28 years. In the assembly, the Democrats expanded their numbers from 130 to 180. If the Justice Party, which is generally liberal in many ways, joins, that becomes 186 or so. If you have 180 votes in that parliament, you can fast-track legislation and you can overcome a filibuster. The result is that more legislation will now move forward, and it will move forward more quickly. However, as the Korea Times reported and many others, quote, the win also heralds no major shift in Moon's major policies, such as income-driven growth and campaign to phase out the country's nuclear energy use, lend support to Moon's core initiatives, such as reforming the justice sector, reforming the prosecution, and giving police more investigative authority. Among the policies the government will push now particularly are expansionary economic policy, on fiscal policies. The IMF expects now that the GDP will be negative growth of 1.2%. This shows that the new Democratic majority has their work cut out for it. If the Democrats, very similar to those in the U.S., and this is important for those of us in the U.S. side, if they are the only remaining legitimate political forces, then how will they manage their growing power? For one, and importantly, the two main factions will be exposed, the two main factions within the Democratic Party. This is not a bad thing. The two factions represent the two main professional and modern strands of nationalist thinking, and that's the good kind of nationalism. Loosely, these would be the Kim Dae-jung and Nomu-hyun factions. The split of the Nomu-hyun group from the Kim Dae-jung group after No was elected at the end of 2002 helped usher in the lost 10 years, quote unquote, of backward and corrupt Lee Myung-bak and Park Geun-hye presidencies. This was particularly stark during the election of 2012, when some Kim Dae-jung loyalists not only abandoned Democratic candidate Moon Jae-in, but they threw their support publicly behind Madam Park Geun-hye. That's a clear and dramatic demonstration of this split within the Democrats, and that split which allowed the conservatives to retake government after only 10 years. The partial reuniting of these two factions during the broad anti-Park candlelight demonstrations of winter 2016 and the subsequent snap election in spring 2017 brought back a stronger Democratic bloc. That intra-democratic cooperation was tentative, however, since the Nomu-hyun group was famously insular, cult-like, and had a nasty edge. After 3 years of the now Nomu-hyun Moon Jae-in group in government, the great significance of the 21st Assembly elections is that the Democratic factions have united for power and policy reasons, making the Democratic movement now evolved into a strong Democratic establishment, more united than it has ever been in government. From the viewpoint of many Democrats, today's 180-seat Democratic Party and supporters are the Korea that has been trying to be born since at least 1971, when Kim Dae-jung first ran for president. Remember, Kim almost certainly would have won a fair election that year, and this makes the subsequent government attempts to kill him and his repeated quests for the presidency a bit easier to understand. The Kim Dae-jung faction now has been largely eclipsed. at least symbolically marked by the defeats of the bigwigs Park Ji-won and Chung Dong-yeon. But the new, stronger democratic establishment still contains two main factions. Very much like the U.S. Democrats, they're moderate establishment and modern progressive. The new progressives have witnessed high level of corruption and mismanagement, as well as widely disparate foreign policies. And again, like U.S. Democrats, they have ideas, pardon me, again, like U.S. Democrats, they have ideas about how to make major structural advances. Remember, this is the way Elizabeth Warren talks, and the way the progressives talk, AOC in America. In South Korea, that's a broad group. In a policy sense, this translates into the story of the Moon Jae-in presidency. The moderate establishment is represented by President Moon and his most trusted advisors and ministers. They are the establishment. They're the Pelosi Schumers. The modern progressive group is committed to support this government, while at the same time, it's terribly frustrated with Moon's tentative, risk-averse, and overcautious policies. Many believe current policies on economic structures, North Korea, and the U.S. alliance are non-strategic, laden with self-defeating myths, and just plain wrong. President Moon's core policy initiatives will now be pushed forward. Reform of the prosecution under Justice Minister Chu Mi-ae, economic management of the COVID-19 fallout, restructuring of supply chains in reaction to Chinese, Japanese, and American trade bullying. And Moon's policy of enhanced engagement worldwide would go forward. But some big and important policy initiatives that have been prevented for years will not get the support they need in the next 2 years. And that will frustrate many Koreans. This will be due to the administration's failure to appreciate its own middle power capabilities, to its capture by deep and paralyzing myths that remain, and to its lack of strategic coordination among policies. These initiatives would include taking a leading role organizing the United Nations and other international NGOs for a range of urgent tasks, from North Korean nuclear nonproliferation to arms control to infrastructure development to regional cooperation. The government is unlikely to finally make real and substantial progress on forcing the chaebol into a broader, healthier domestic economy, enforcing anti-monopoly laws that would allow broader small and medium enterprise development. It is unlikely to finally get rid of the anti-democratic national security law. And it'll be unable to address the change of presidential system, which has been planned for about 23 years, into a 2 4-year term system. I remember at least 20 years ago, Yano and I debating this in a car riding around Seoul. And I understand all the arguments about it, but the single 5-year term is in a sense practically unworkable. And at some point that'll have to be addressed. So to wind up, the list, the 21st century assembly elections suggest that Korea's Democrats, and more importantly, its small d Democrats, will be driving policy for another decade, and perhaps longer. Government policies that are viewed in Europe as modern and mainstream will finally become more mainstream in Korea. But more ambitious and achievable restructuring, much of which has had to be put off since democratization, will not be attempted by this government. This is both for the moderate reasons that I described and also for the need to address the coronavirus economic fallout in the next 2 years. Such restructuring would involve both economic and social structures at home, energy and environmental policies, and regional and international relations. Slide 7, please. For that reason, the split between establishment and progressive Democrats will now emerge to help define the 2022 presidential election. having a non-ideological, non-personality-driven, non-corrupt, and competent administration should not be such an unusual occurrence in a modern, developed democracy. But today, that is unusual. Look at the U.S., Japan, China, UK. So Korea is lucky to be in this position after many decades of terribly compromised government. Korea's Democrats, both establishment and progressive, now have 2 years to demonstrate that they can harness the country's strengths to fight COVID-19 and manage an economic comeback. The next government, if it remains under control of Democrats, will have the larger task of completing Korea's evolution into a more confident middle power that puts its strengths to work, making big, practical, and long-awaited advances in domestic and international policy. Next slide, please. This is just a reminder that at stake are the biggest things that have been broiling both in Korea, on the peninsula, and in the region for 70 years and more. These things are at stake as we look at possible democratic control for another 5 to 10 years. And I'm going to leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you very much for your analysis in a broad historical context. Let me turn it over to Celeste.
Thank you very much, Yonel, and for all of our staff at GWIC for organizing this webinar. I'm going to start out with a few general comments or observations about the election, and then delve into how the conservatives fared in this particular National Assembly election. So if you look around the world, the retreat of democracy in this pandemic era is evident in many countries, but I think Korea shines out as an inspiring example of democracy alive and well. So on the one hand, South Korean voters showed their commitment to democracy by turning out in droves. The early voting turnout rates are the highest ever. And as Yonel mentioned, and Steve mentioned as well, turnout on election day was at 66.2%, the highest in almost 3 decades. I think this indicates also South Korean voters' confidence in their government's measures to mitigate infection while holding an election during the pandemic. It also indicates South Korean voters' discipline in terms of following the guidelines that the government put in place, which included temperature checks at polling stations, hand sanitizers, gloves, and social distancing as Korean voters voted. So the South Korean government's centralized and very detailed guidelines on how to actually execute the election in order to reduce the risks of infection in this pandemic, I think are noteworthy and remarkable, but South Korean voters' adherence to them and their confidence in democratic institutions and democratic processes is also commendable. Whether the government's measures to reduce infections were enough, I think the next few weeks will tell as we look at infection rates. But I do feel hopeful and inspired by South Korean voters' performance in this election. On the other hand, the conservatives faced a tremendous blow in this election. It was a defeat for conservatives. Even though COVID-19 dominated this election and the new electoral rules in the proportional representation portion of the seats in the National Assembly, which are 47 seats out of 300, these are kind of new factors. We saw a number of familiar patterns in South Korean party politics and electoral politics, and I want to highlight 3. The first is that Korean political parties are notoriously under-institutionalized. That just means that they change names and reorganize and realign very frequently. The second point that I want to draw out from looking at the conservatives in this election is that there's an overdependence on bigwigs in the parties, or the fate of key figures or leaders in the parties often determines how the party as a whole fares. And the third is that regionalism showed that it remains strong in this election. After looking at these three factors, I'll conclude with a brief look at some of the other dynamics that we saw in this election. So let me take up the first slide, or my only slide here actually, to show you just how bad of a defeat this was for conservatives. Mine, can you put up the slide, please?
Yes, it's loading.
Okay, thanks. So in 2016, the last National Assembly election, conservatives, which were coalesced in a different party name, so that's two parties ago, had 122 seats. And by the end of this election last week, conservatives had just 103 seats. If you include the United Future Party, UFP, and its satellite party, Future Korea Party, which was aimed at getting proportional representation seats. So just the decline from 122 seats to 103 is not great news for the conservatives. The United Future Party was arguably the opposite of what Steve described among Democrats, and that is that it was a very new party and ill-prepared and exhibited quite a bit of elite disunity in the party. So the United Future Party was only formed in mid-February, just a few months ago. And as I mentioned, since 2016, conservatives have had at least two major party names. So they've been reforming and reforming since 2016's National Assembly election. The United Future Party coalesced after a rocky start to the Future Korea Party, which was that proportional representation party, which was aimed at taking advantage of new electoral rules that were enacted in December 2019. The process of forming that party was rocky. It was renamed several times. Its leaders disagreed about how to nominate candidates and how to move forward as a conservative satellite party. And as a result, you had then the formation of the Future Korea Party on somewhat unstable ground. So the elite disunity among conservatives is especially evident in the fact that the gray independent voters on this figure, not voters, independent lawmakers on this figure, 4 out of 5 of those independents are actually major conservative figures. So they decided to not even participate in the conservative parties, the United Future Party or the Future Korea Party. One of those 4 independents who won in last week's election is Hong Joon-pyo, who was the #2 vote getter after President Moon Jae-in in the 2017 snap election. So you had considerable disunity among conservative leaders, and Korean voters also displayed a time-worn trend of being very good at throwing the bums out or voting the bums out. And so voters decided to not elect many of the leaders in the conservative bloc. So that includes the chairman of the United Future Party, Hwang Kyo-an, who was the prime minister under former President Park Geun-hye, who was impeached in 2017. And he lost to Moon Jae-in's former prime minister, Lee Na-kyun. In addition, the former Seoul mayor, who was a conservative, lost his seat, and a number of other leaders within the conservative United Future Party lost their seats. Besides the disunity among leaders within the conservatives, another familiar pattern in this election was the lack of a clear policy platform from conservatives. It's pretty clear that the policy platform, as murky as it was also unpopular with voters. So going into this election, the conservatives emphasized that this election was a referendum on Moon Jae-in's performance. In particular, most immediately, his performance in dealing with the pandemic, but in addition, his referendum on his performance for the last 3 years. In terms of the pandemic, the conservatives leading into this election questioned whether the Moon Jae-in administration had doctored infection data to make it seem like the Moon Jae-in administration was more effective in sort of flattening the curve or dealing with this pandemic. It also accused the Moon Jae-in administration of restricting who could get tests for COVID-19, although the Korean Centers for Disease Control has denied that. But more broadly, the conservatives tried to emphasize that all this focus on COVID-19 was blinding voters to the pre-pandemic poor performance of President Moon Jae-in. They tried to emphasize that over the last 3 years, he had had a number of weaknesses in his performance and his governance, and it didn't seem like voters responded well to that emphasis. So the conservatives tried to gain votes by first of all warning that if Moon Jae-in and the Democrats' control over policy became unfettered with a large majority in the National Assembly, that Moon Jae-in might, for example, rehabilitate his controversial former Justice Minister, Cho Guk, whose scandals led to conflicting protests of over 1 million on each side, pro-Cho Guk and anti-Cho Guk, last year. The conservatives also warned that an unfettered Moon Jae-in administration and Democratic Party of Korea would also push through major reforms to the prosecution and to criminal justice. And that those major reforms would really reduce, so conservatives argued, reduce the prosecution's ability to conduct investigations of politically charged cases. In particular, for example, the Democrats' alleged election rigging in the Ulsan mayoral race. So politically salient cases might be less investigatable under a reformed prosecution. However, if you take a look at the policy platform of the United Future Party, the conservatives, it's really unclear what their alternative plan was, in particular for dealing with COVID-19. So they didn't have a clear alternative plan for recovering from this pandemic, for example. And the emphasis on trying to look at Moon Jae-in's pre-pandemic performance was really drowned out by this overwhelming focus on the COVID-19 situation. In addition, the conservatives faced some embarrassing candidate situations. So, for example, they had to expel one candidate ahead of the election because he had accused 2 fathers of victims of the Seoul ferry sinking of having engaged in inappropriate sexual acts. And this was embarrassing for in terms of the party being able to manage its candidates. In addition, the election was held the day before the 6th anniversary of the Seoul ferry sinking. So basically, these familiar patterns of a lack of a clear policy platform and party leaders' disunity are part of the vicious cycle that contributes to the famous under-institutionalization of South Korean political parties. So that we've had scores of political parties since Korea's democratization in 1987, and we can expect probably that the United Future Party, that name will not last particularly long after this electoral defeat last week. Already, the Hwang Kyo-an, the chairman of the United Future Party, who lost his election, has resigned, and you should expect some major party reshuffling from among the conservatives to try to deal with the fallout of this election. Now, historically, as Steve also mentioned, National Assembly elections that are held in between the presidential elections in South Korea are usually the time when you see most jockeying to demonstrate viability as a future presidential candidate. And if you look at the leadership disarray and losses in the Conservative Party, this puts the Conservative bloc in a rather weak position leading up to the 2022 presidential election. So the defeats of the leaders for the United Future Party are not a good sign for the Conservatives. By contrast, as Steve mentioned, Moon Jae-in and the Democrats' high approvals and election victories are a sign that they are much better positioned for the 2022 election. In some respects, 2 years is a very short time. At the same time, much can happen in 2 years. Nobody would have predicted the pandemic that we're now in the midst of. So I don't want to definitively say that the Conservatives are going into the presidential election in 2022 on a weak footing, but immediately after this election, that sure seems to be the case. In addition, this is the first time since 1987 that the Democrats have won a large enough block, 3/5 of the National Assembly seats, to push through bills. So since 2012, the National Assembly Advancement Act, all bills coming to a plenary session vote had to receive approval from 3/5 of lawmakers. And so clearly the Democrats have reached that hurdle and will not need to gain approval from conservatives. All of this to say is that Moon Jae-in seems to have a strong basis off of which to govern leading up to the 2022 election, whereas the conservatives seem to be on a much weaker footing and don't have a clear set of potential presidential candidates coming out of this National Assembly election. At the same time, I just want to briefly mention, although Steve mentioned regionalism already in voting patterns, in the 2017 presidential election and the 2018 local elections, it seemed like the historic tendency for the southeast of Korea to vote heavily for conservatives and the southwest of Korea to vote heavily for Democrats or progressives, that those maybe had been reduced a little bit. There was more even voting, and some conservatives won in the southwest and vice versa, progressives won in the southeast. This election seemed to be a return to more solidly southwest going for the Democrats and the southeast going for the conservatives. I'll include in those conservatives the independent conservative bigwigs that I mentioned, those 4 out of 5 independents who are conservative bigwigs like Hong Joon-pyo, who was the runner-up in the 2017 presidential election. Let me conclude by saying Korean voters continue to be very good at throwing the bums out. We have a lot of freshmen in this new National Assembly coming in next month. And among them, you have a number of women. So record numbers of women, up 2% from the previous National Assembly. So we'll now have 57 women out of 300 seats in the National Assembly, about 19%. Among women, there was an unprecedented organizing that happened ahead of this election, and that was the formation of a feminist women's party that had formed earlier this year. In addition, defectors or former residents of North Korea had formed their own party for the first time, and we have a record number of former North Korean residents in the National Assembly now, with one from a single-member district in Gangnam. He's the famous defector Tae Yong-ho, who had been the number 2 at the British Embassy, and we have a defector from a proportional representation seat. All of these new initiatives, new faces in the National Assembly will be followed closely. However, the proportional representation system that was implemented in December, which was intended to help small parties gain access to the National Assembly, really didn't work out that way. Instead, you had the satellite parties of the Democrats and the conservatives really taking the bulk of the proportional representation seats, and not so much small new parties. So I'll just conclude here by saying for the Conservatives, there's a lot of work to be done before the 2022 presidential election. And you saw many of the familiar patterns of South Korean politics playing out in this election, including the renaming and reshuffling and realigning of political parties and disunity among leaders within those parties. However, Korean voters continue to inspire voters around the world with their active participation in elections and their active ability to hold their lawmakers accountable. Thank you.
Thank you, Celeste. Thank you for your comprehensive analysis of the Conservative Party's performance. Now, let me turn it over to Hung-Kyu.
The invitation. Can you hear me? Okay. I sincerely appreciate the invitation. I really hope to see the spring blossom in Washington D.C. In offline. As Celeste and Steve were point out, the ruling Democratic Party of President Moon Jae-in won a landslide victory in the general election, securing a solid majority in the 300-member National Assembly. The Democratic Party and the Citizen Party got 180 seats, the first time of such victories since the South Korea introduced its current political system in 1987. This landslide victory indicates 4 points in Korean politics. First, we witness a kind of paradigm shift in transition in Korean politics. It's a kind of change of mainstreams in Korean politics from an industrialization generation to a democratization generations. Korean politics is in a kind of transition, but which is likely to bring a more turmoil actually in the maybe future. Second, strong regionalism still remains powerful in Korean politics, although it has been diluted at the micro level. Third, it is obvious of the downfall of the Park Geun-hye faction, in spite of her last appeal for political support before the election. Fourth, ironically, as a result of the landslide, Korean politics likely enter into turmoil instead of stability. The political competition for a presidential election, which will be held in about 2 years later, are likely stronger. In terms of proportions of votes, there were narrow margins of victories in many districts, in spite of landslide outcomes due to the single-member district electoral system of South Korea. Then let me jump on the implication for foreign policies of this election. First, the policy orientation of a Moon Jae-in government will be more nationalistic and independent. The national identity of Moon Jae-in government is middle power, foreign policy and country. That of former conservative governments were the kind of small, power identity. In spite of their declaration in pursuit of a middle power, the first news we got after the election was a reallocation of the fiscal resources from arms purchase to social safety. And second implication is the about ROK U.S. alliance. The South Korea-U.S. alliance will be much noisier, but not in jeopardy. People and government of South Korea still possess the strong confidence in systems and values of the United States. Koreans understand that the United States has cutting-edge technologies and accumulated knowledge in disease control as well as the industries. The United States is still lead the world and the standard of the world. Okay. However, new mainstream of Korean politics will pursue more autonomy and self-respect as a middle power. They seriously question the loyalty of the U.S. President Donald Trump on the ROK-U.S. alliance. They will also support Moon Jae-in government's tougher negotiation to unprinciple the pressure from Trump administration to instantly increase 5 times its military burden sharing. Third, South Korea will not tilt more toward China after this pandemic, although some people worry about. If you look at the Moon Jae-in's foreign and security policies documented in Moon Jae-in's 100 policy plan, it is quite obvious. The fundamental assumption of this Moon Jae-in government's foreign and security policies is to maintain a strong alliance with the United States. The pandemic alarms the South Korean business communities over the danger of over-reliance on China, although South Korea, like many other countries, relies heavily on China for intermediate supply goods. The South Korean model dealing with the pandemic contrasts to Chinese authoritarian model. South Koreans are quite proud of its experience in industrialization and democratization, and the worldwide fame of the K-pops and cultural industries, and possibly maybe in the future the new democratic, Korean model dealing with the pandemic. Fourth, it is still questionable whether Moon Jae-in's government pursued appeasement policy more aggressively to North Korea while breaking out the UN sanction regime. Due to the changing domestic politics, Moon Jae-in governments may, be more aggressive and then, in putting appeasement policy to North Korea, and then try to resume economic connectivity and then rapprochement. However, strategic calculation in domestic and foreign interest and alignments won't allow the Moon Jae-in government to take the responsibility of abandoning the UN sanction regime. Furthermore, North Korea won't affirmatively respond to the South Korea's appeal to resuming rapprochement policies. North Korea seems already abandoned its strategy of appeasement policies with the United States in assistance from the South Korea. Instead, they focus on self-reliance and strengthening military readiness and friendly relationship with China and Russia. In the long-term perspective, more serious challenges to South Korea's foreign and security environments are deepening U.S.-China strategic competition and the decoupling in various areas after the pandemic. The other challenge is of waning U.S. leadership in the world, the key ally of the South Korea. The main challenge to the United States stems not from external pressures, but from within, in my view. A weakened or lost confidence among American citizens in their own system and the value and principles will pose the greatest challenge, actually. Growing political temptation to erect walls in favor of protectionism, to block global movements of people to curry favor with nationalists, and to serve the spirit of America only or America first at the sacrifice of global leadership, provide an additional challenge to both the United States and South Korea. many of South Korean people carefully, watching over the, maybe next step of Moon Jae-in government, actually, which might be much bolder approaches and flexible in terms of their, policy toward North Korea, maybe toward the United States, which not necessary to be stable, but maybe in turmoil in terms of, continuity of the policies. However, still, Korean people believe there's still the strong alliance with the United States, and then hope to continue to have that kind of alliance. But the problem is, there are so many challenges ahead of us. So we'd better increase strategic communication between these two countries. This is what I really hope. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kim. Thank you for your forward-looking analysis of the South Korea's policy direction. I think that's really helpful for our attendees in trying to understand where South Korea is going. Let me open it up for Q&A now. We have a couple of questions from the attendees. First, let me take the question from Mark Tokola of KEI. So this, I think, for Dr. Kim, Hung-Kyu Kim. You briefly mentioned regionalism being diluted at the micro level in this election. Could you a little bit elaborate on that?
Okay. If you look at the outcome of the current general elections, there's a clear kind of line between the conservative and then also the Democratic parties. And but if you look at the micro level, there are a kind of mixture of the supports even within the conservative region. I mean eastern part, and then there are a burgeoning of constituents supporting Democratic parties. And also, if you look at the more details, I think the regionalism has been diluted gradually. But if you just look at the outcome of the general election, and there is a clear cut between the area of supporting Democratic Party and Conservative Party. But in details, that kind of cutting line has been diluted. If you look at the small regions and each by each, so that's what I'm trying to say.
Let me follow up on that question. Dr. Kim, you also mentioned that if you look at the popular votes, the Democratic Party cannot say it is a landslide victory for them, right? The difference of the vote count is not that large. So when we look forward, like eyeing at the presidential election in 2 years, what kind of implication can you get that from that popular vote count?
Hey, if you look at the kind of district level of the voting outcomes, that was actually the neck-to-neck elections. The margin of victory was quite small in many districts. So it is so Democratic Party's constituents are not necessary to be strong enough to support for whatever policies they conduct. So it's quite reversible, by a small win. Okay. So even though it was a landslide victory, but the possibly presidential election in 2 years, it doesn't guarantee the affirmative or positive outcomes. So current ruling party must be very cautious, and then also the look at the change of a small win in the people's heart. They already had a kind of experience in the nominance area. They was a majority at the moment, and then so they were quite competent, and then push forward the reform measures, and but consecutively they failed to in executing the reforms. The outcome, the result of the next election is their total failing getting heart of people. So that was a kind of a disaster for them. They lost the presidential election to the Lee Myung-bak, and then also their following their local elections. So they got the lesson from the kind of defeat, even though they got the majority at the moment. So they must be quite cautious, because the margin of victory is not that big enough.
Thank you. I have a question from Kingston Chingakem. The voting age was lowered from 19 to 18 years old. How did this impact in the elections? And I would add one more question, related to this question. How would you, characterize the demographic changes in terms of, voters' support for either, Democratic or the conservative parties? So, Celeste, do you want to start first? No? Okay, then please raise your hand if you want to go first.
I'll just add one thing to Hongil's comments just now. The only presidential candidate who's gotten more than 50% of the vote is Park Geun-hye in 2012. And so South Korean presidential elections always hinge on relatively small vote margins. But what we have seen since democratization in South Korea is that the opposition parties are very good at splitting the vote and losing the election. So in terms of elite disunity within the conservatives, potentially they have 2 years now to figure out how to field and unify behind a strong candidate in order to win more votes and to capitalize on those small vote margins that we saw in many of the single member districts in South Korea.
Yes, Steve.
I would very much agree with what
A little bit louder, please.
Steve, could you please try without your earphone?
Can you hear now? Okay. This was a very lucky election for the Democrats. 6 weeks earlier, the numbers might have been quite different, as Professor Kim pointed out. It was a very odd combination of, on the one hand, the Democrats in a sweet spot right when their government response to coronavirus was showing all the results and getting appreciation from the world. The conservatives, progressively for the last 5-10 years, have been falling apart. And in particular this year under Hwang Kyo-ahn, they looked like fringe nutcases most of the time. The third item, of course, was the coronavirus, and this sort of out of nowhere. So the Democrats cannot expect this situation to continue very long. And that's why I think both of you have suggested as well that the Democrats' response to the coronavirus economically, in terms of economic support for all different sectors of society, economic support for businesses, and somehow overcoming this 1.2 negative growth rate is going to really determine how they look in 2 years. The second thing I'd say about the demographics, Ask a Korean was fascinating in a couple of the things he pointed out, but one of them he keeps pointing out is that young men, males, are some of the most conservative groups, the way they vote. except for them, it looks very much as if, from 50 down, everyone is voting a little more Democratic. But it is odd to see this one group of conservative, of young men, not young women, but young men, becoming more conservative.
Thank you. Let me go to move on to the next question I have. Jacob Hollander. So in 2019, ROK nearly pulled out of an intelligence agreement due to Japanese trade tactics. Will a Democratic Party with moderate progressive division link ROK-Japan security cooperation with Japanese trade behavior in the future? Steve, you have to unmute.
Hello? Can you hear
Yes,
me now? Okay.
now I can hear you.
I'm not sure that the South Korean position on this will change much. There was a fascinating story in the Nikkei paper just the other day. Their point was that now, because Lee Nak-yoon is going to be a presidential candidate and he's considered pro-Japan, they worried that now the whole presidential election will be pro-Japan versus anti-Japan among South Korean presidential candidates, and this will make Japan a punching bag. I mean, I think this is terribly overwrought, but it's fascinating to see that. But in terms of, looking at how the GOSIMA will be renegotiated, I think that there's plenty of evidence that the South Korean administration will continue right where they have been, waiting for Japan to come to them a bit before they were to, if they were to continue with this and make it solid.
Yes, Celeste?
Yeah, let me just add, I agree with Steve. In a sense, the Korean moderates who did not favor the hard line and sort of retributive approach of the Moon Jae-in administration towards Japan maybe can thank the pandemic for moving the tensions between the U.S. and between Japan and South Korea off of the headlines. All of last year, for the most part, we were talking entirely about tensions between South Korea and Japan. I think Japanese can also thank the pandemic in a sense for distracting South Korean policymakers from bashing Japan. So in a sense, we've sort of put that very difficult issue to rest a little bit, but every time you see an election coming back up, especially this 2022 election, when hopefully the pandemic will not be the main issue in that election, I think you have the risk of anti-Japanese or pro-Japanese being a key cleavage, especially among progressives in that election. And to the extent that policymakers and bureaucrats in both Japan and South Korea can use this relatively quieter, less public attention phase to make headway and have productive conversations. I hope that they will be doing that, as opposed to just throwing their hands up and saying now the Moon Jae-in administration is unfettered and it will just continue to bash Japan and not be productive in its dealings with Japan. So hopefully we have some cooler heads prevail and creative thinking about how to deal with the difficult past between Japan and South Korea.
Dr. Kim?
Every Korean government when they start their their presidency, and then they really strongly support the better relationship with Japan, and they try to strengthen the partnership with Japan and then more cooperation. But domestic politics always matters, and then some politicians or some top leaders utilize the anti-Japanism or anti-Koreanism to mobilize their supporters, and then which has very strong constituents as well, and so they continue to have kind of problems, and then now Japan is rather in kind of urgent situation. So they see the new competitor in the region. Korea is rising, and then also they are much more industrialized, and then so they put the Korea to the corner, which consider South Korea as orbit of Chinese kingdom or Chinese influence. But the fact is not true, and then but intentionally Japanese describe South Korea as a kind of a country which may be much closer to the maybe used to be a part of the maybe Chinese influence. But South Koreans DNA and including the North Koreans DNA is has a certain special a sense of maybe anti-Chinese, and then also they knew how to deal with Chinese power, and so Koreans and like Vietnamese will be the last nationalities to succumb to Chinese pressure, and as you see in the SARC issues, and so the key issue is the how to find a way out for the both countries leaders to get the kind of point for cooperation and the necessity of cooperation, the new challenges in the 21st centuries, and then they have a common grounds actually a lot, and so there are so many intellectuals and which really hope to promote the further cooperation between these two countries. But problem is the domestic politics. Also those who utilize the kind of anti-sentiment to gain their own political asset in their countries. So we have to really work out here to promote better relationship in the future. But in the near future, it is not necessarily optimistic. But after this presidency, maybe we can find a way out to get closer and to communicate to each other, and then find a way out for the cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you. Next question is from John Fay at State, I guess State Department, but there's no way I can verify. But anyway, the question is, with the strengthening of the ruling party's majority and the corresponding increased public support, should we expect additional intra-Korean initiatives and greater divergence between leaders' priorities? Yes, Steve.
Yeah, I would just say, in terms of the approach to North Korea, I think this particular administration has boxed itself in quite completely. They would probably continue what they're doing, and as Professor Kim said, they may have additional attempts to do outreach to North Korea that avoids sanctions problems. But this will be at a relatively low level, and North Korea, of course, will continue to see South Korea as subjugating itself to the U.S. Therefore, it's very hard to see much at all that South Korea would do that would be new. In the larger picture, it may be important that South Koreans have watched as both China, Japan, and the U.S. have used trade for non-trade reasons to bully South Korea. And up to a point, they've all been successful, particularly China and the U.S. This is really at the root of things, and it challenges both the Democratic narrative, Democratic Party narrative of their relationships with China, Japan, and the U.S., but it also challenges conservative narratives, as if conservatives didn't have many problems already. So I think that's something to watch. Korea's general reaction to these non-trade bullying from Japan, the U.S., and China. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other speakers who want to? Yes, Lance.
Yeah, I'll just add, I agree with Steve, and North-South relations are going to be probably dependent on both the pandemic and North Korea's willingness to re-engage in talks. And if I were Kim Jong-un, which thankfully I'm not, re-engaging in talks with Moon Jae-in in an era in which the Trump presidency may be over at the end of the year is not particularly productive. I think Kim Jong-un has shown a preference for negotiating with the U.S. and as a sort of byproduct with South Korea as well. And so in a year when the U.S. is going to have a presidential election, hopefully in November, I don't think that we have a lot of optimism for reopening of talks. Certainly North Korea's behavior so far this year has not shown any kind of positive signs in that direction. And it seems to have shut itself entirely with the COVID-19 threat.
Yes, Dr. Kim.
Yeah, for a long time, the North Korea has had a kind of identity of weak, power, and but now under the Kim Jong-un's the leadership, they are changing their identity from the weak power to the strong power, which possessing the nuclear weapons, and also the maybe military readiness. So they just temporarily. They think about changing their strategies and then getting close to the United States and then to solve their economic problems. And but with ongoing U.S.-China strategic competition, it is impossible for North Korea to move kind of bold approaches, to move to the close to the United States. They cannot bear the suspicion and then also pressure from China. So they changed their tactics again. They returned to their own tactics. They seems to believe that they are old brother to South Korea at least, and then your young brother. So they want to be dominant on the Korean Peninsula. So they put the emphasis on the self-reliance and the military readiness, and also utilizing the support from the China and Russia, and to push the South Korea to the corner. And so they don't want respond to the South Koreans' initiative formatively for the time being. Maybe after the coronavirus, this pandemic, they may take a certain initiative, but it is not change of strategy, but tactical change. So which will push the South Korea to the corner. So I believe at this moment, North Korea is not really seriously thinking about rapprochement with South Korea as well as with the United States. So they will wait.
Thank you. I think with that we're run out of time, and I think we have to conclude today's webinar. I'd like to thank all the speakers for taking their time, and our technical team for putting this together, Min-hye, Emir, Richard, and Helen. And thank you all for joining us. Stay safe and healthy. Thank you.